Good morning, everyone. I was impressed with your O's there on the Oh Happy Day song. We are going to continue through the book of Judges today with Judges chapter 18. And since we took mercy on Chuck and didn't have him read the whole chapter, you probably want to turn there with me now. Because if you look at the beginning, Chuck didn't read this, but if you look at the very beginning of chapter 18, it begins with those ominous words that are repeated frequently throughout the end of the book of Judges. In those days, Israel had no king. So there was no king in Israel. There was no human person directing the people of God in the way they should live. But in addition to that, God also was not their king. So each person did whatever they thought was right. When God is not king, and instead we decide right and wrong for ourselves, we call that sin. And illustrated in the stories at the end of the book of Judges, we see the consequences of sin. The consequences of not following God. The consequences of each person deciding for themselves. And we have to face it when we think about this. The fact is, you and I are not perfect in our devotion to God. All of us, at times, usually too often, reject God as our king. We do what we see is fit. We sin. And we are like all of mankind in that. We reach out and eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We decide for ourselves what's right and wrong, what's good and evil. And also, like every man and every woman throughout all of history, seldom in that moment of decision do we ever consider the consequences of that choice. We don't consider the immediate consequences of our rejection as God as king. If we did, we might think better of it. But we certainly don't consider the far-reaching, long-lasting, and potentially devastating consequences of sin. Because what we know from the Bible and what we know from life experience is that sin, even one little sin, can affect far more than just the guilty person. And it can have far longer lasting effects than anyone would think possible. But we don't think about that, and we choose to reject God anyway. And that is what we see in Judges chapter 18. It tells us that the tribe of Dan, the Danites, had no place to live. You see, when the Israelites entered the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, the land was divided up, and each tribe was told where to go and to take over their territory, relying on God to drive the people out so that they could have their inheritance. And what we know is that some of the tribes of Israel obeyed completely and did what they were told. Some of them obeyed partially. And then there were others, like the tribe of Dan, that chose not to obey God at all. They decided they didn't like the way God had done it, and they wanted to find their better way. The problem for Dan was they looked at the people who lived there, decided they couldn't win the fight because they weren't trusting God, and decided, it's too hard. We'll just do it another way. And when we choose to disobey God, there are consequences, often consequences that last a long time. So at this point, because they disobeyed God, the whole tribe of Dan has no inheritance. And what they're doing is looking around to see where they can settle to live. Now, of course, they could just, obey God and go take their area. But they decided that was too hard. They chose to decide for themselves. So they send representatives to look around the area to find a good place for their tribe to live. And while the representatives are looking around, they come to Micah's house. Yes, Micah from the last chapter, who stole his mother's silver, made some idols, built a shrine, and hired a Levite as his priest. That Micah. And of course, we saw last week that all those are sinful behaviors. because Micah did what he thought was best instead of following God. And as the Danites are near his house, they recognize the voice of the Levite, probably because he had a distinct accent. And they decide to ask him, to ask God, if their journey to find a place will be successful. Now, if you're a thinking person, you would think that God's answer has to be, go do what I told you to do. But the Levite tells them that they have Yahweh's approval. He does this, of course, without ever asking God. I mean, as if a shrine for false idols asking the true God would be fitting there, but it is what the Levite was hired to do. Give false answers from a false religious setup. Rejecting God as king, deciding for themselves. It's what Micah hired the Levite to do. So the Danites continue their exploration of the territory, not their own, and come across the city of Laish, which is a prosperous city. It's in a nice area, and most importantly, it is unprotected. It is a long way from anyone who might come to help them. So the spies return home, back to the rest of their tribe, and tell them to get ready to go because they found the place that they're going to live. And that's what they do. They all get ready. They set out, the whole tribe, all the people, and the fighting men of the tribe, heading towards Laish to take it over. And on their way, they come across Micah's house. And the spies point out that at Micah's house, there are some valuable things there. There's an ephod, household gods, and there's an idol and an image that we know from the previous chapter was made with $10,000 worth of silver. So the spies say in verse 14, you know what to do. Wink, wink. So they go in and they take those things out of Micah's shrine. This is what happens when people reject God as their king. When they don't listen to him, but instead do whatever they see fit. You have chaos. And while they're doing this, the Levite attempts to stop them. He says, hey, what are you doing there? They say, be quiet. Come with us instead. Isn't it better for you to be the priest of a whole tribe instead of just one guy's house? And the Bible says that the priest was very pleased with this idea. So, the Levite helped the Danites steal Micah's stuff. This is just what we've seen all through this story. This is, again, what happens when God is not the definer of right and wrong. When God is not king. People do whatever they want. So they steal Micah's stuff, and they all leave. They put their livestock and the children in front of the group, and that makes them look like a traveling group of nomads, but it also puts the fighting men in the back, protecting the back of the group where, someone who's angry might be coming from. Because a short while later, Micah and his friends realize what has happened, and they chase down the Danites. In verse 23, they chase down the Danites, yelling after them, and the Danite says, why are you upset with us? And Micah says, you took all my stuff and my priest. What else do I have? This probably indicates, by the way, that Micah was making his living off of people coming to his false shrine. Really nice. But when we get to this point in the story, in fairness to the Danites, what basis does Micah have for his complaint against them? Why is it wrong that they took his stuff? I mean, he thinks it's wrong. What does that mean? You see, in a situation where each person decides for themselves right and wrong, what does one person's definition matter? He thinks it's wrong, but they think it's fine. And there's more of them. This is the danger when each person does as they see fit. It's actually even the danger in a society that governs by majority rule. The majority can reject God, can be wrong, can abuse others, and if you're living by majority rule, can't be questioned because they're the majority. That's why it's so important to have God as king. Because every society that operates individually or nationally apart from God as the definer of right and wrong, apart from Jesus as king, will abuse, steal, mistreat, take advantage of, use, and molest others. And I can say that every society like that will do that because every society in history like that has, including ours. This is the result of the sinful behavior that is sure to happen when we reject God as king, because without him, we are incapable of good. Without him, we have no ultimate authority to appeal to for the correction of behavior. Without him, we have no true guide to point the way. Jesus must be king. And when he isn't, the result is often a might makes right situation. That's what we have in Judges chapter 18. Micah says, "You stole my stuff, give it back." The Danites say, "Keep quiet, or some men might get angry and attack you." You're talking about themselves. And there's more of them than him. So when Micah sees that they're stronger than him, too strong for him to resist, he turns around and goes home. And the Danites go on their way and attack the peaceful and unsuspecting city of Laish and take it over. They rename it Dan because they're the tribe of Dan, and if you're from the tribe of Dan, everything has to be named Dan. And they set up, the Bible tells us, they set up Micah's idols in that town and make Jonathan, who was probably the Levite they hired, the priest. And be sure to see the very end of this chapter. The very end of this chapter says that they used the false idols of Micah all the time the house of God, the tabernacle, was at Shiloh, and that these false priests led them until the time of the captivity of the land. I don't want you to miss that detail because it tells you something huge that we would often read over. It means that for the rest of the history of the nation of Israel, all throughout Samuel's leadership, all throughout the reigns of Saul and David and Solomon, through all the kingships of the kings of Israel, there was false worship in Dan. They did stop using the Micah's false idols, but that's because they got a better one when King Jeroboam came to the throne and he gave them one of his golden calves to worship there. That's 1 Kings chapter 12. But what this means, I want to put this in scale for you. That means that for more than 500 years, longer than this nation has been in existence. If you think about it, the colony of Jamestown was founded in 1607. That's not 500 years ago. Christopher Columbus was sailing his boats about 500 years ago. So for that period of time, 500 years, more than 500 years, there was false worship in Dan. That's what happens when God is not king. That's what happens when each person decides for themselves and does what they think is best. The far-reaching, long-lasting consequences of sin. But just take a pause and think with me for a second. Where did all this start? What was the origin of more than 500 years of idolatry encompassing 1/12 of the tribes of Israel? Think of all the people who lived and died and worshiped falsely there in all those years. What momentous, in fact, event could have triggered the downfall and corruption of so many? I mean, surely it must have been something catastrophic, something devastating. What was it? Well, you could say that it's the result of Judges chapter 17, verse 6, that there was no king in Israel and everyone did as they saw fit. That's true. But what was the genesis, the very beginning, the initiating event that corrupted a whole tribe of Israel? Micah stole silver from his mother. Micah decided to disobey God and stole something. That is the origin of this whole problem. This is the danger that we need to see in our own lives when we consider rejecting Jesus as king, when we consider doing what we think is best. It is the snowball effect of sin. If Micah hadn't stolen the silver, the idols would not have been made. If the idols had not been made, the shrine would not have been set up. If the shrine hadn't been set up, the Levite wouldn't have been hired. If the Levite hadn't been hired, the Danites wouldn't have recognized his voice and come to the shrine. If the Danites hadn't come to the shrine, they wouldn't have seen the idols. If they hadn't have seen the idols, they wouldn't have stolen them later. If they hadn't have stolen them later, they couldn't have set them up in their own new town. If they hadn't set the idols up, false worship would not have begun in Dan. If false worship hadn't begun, The tribe wouldn't have continued it for hundreds of years, all from one dumb decision to steal. Now, do you think Micah thought about corrupting a whole tribe of Israel when he was deciding whether or not to take the silver? Do you think it even entered his mind? Do you think that if you could time travel back to that moment when Micah made the choice to sin and reject God's way, if you told him the consequences, if you told him what was going to happen, what do you think he would have said? Would he have believed you? No. You and I both know what he would have said. He would have said, no way. There's no way one little wrong decision could have such widespread consequences. But what we see here is that is exactly what happened. But in that moment, Micah could not have even conceived that what he was choosing to do would have such a big effect. He didn't think of that. Didn't even enter into his mind when he was considering whether or not to disobey God. What about you? Yesterday, when you chose to disobey God, did that affect others? Did you even think about it? Later on today, when you choose to disobey God, will that one dumb decision corrupt an entire nation? Later on today, if you tell a lie to someone, is that going to corrupt the world? If you're driving home from church today and you get mad at someone in traffic and you yell at them out of anger, is that going to mess up the balance of society? Kids, if you disobey your parents later today, is that going to corrupt a nation? When you have a spirit of complaining, is that going to mess everyone else up? If you don't seek reconciliation, if you choose to disobey the Bible and not assemble with other Christians, if you stay silent when you should speak up, if you don't show God's love to other people, if you just decide to be lazy, will those things affect someone else? Would that corrupt someone away from God? How could you know? You think you don't have that kind of influence over the world. Micah didn't know. Micah didn't think he had that kind of influence over the world. He couldn't fathom the depth of the consequence of his choice. I'm sure he didn't think he had that kind of influence over the future of a whole tribe of Israel that he hadn't even met. The lesson we need to learn, the point we need to see is that our sin, every sin, when we reject God as king and decide to go our own way, the consequences of that decision are far-reaching and unimaginable. We see this throughout all of history and particularly in the Bible. You don't go with the army to war, commit adultery, murder a man, kill a baby, corrupt an entire nation fighting over allegiance between you and your son. Here in this story, steal some silver, corrupt a whole tribe to idolatry for more than 500 years. We go back to the first one. Eat some fruit, corrupt the whole world, and doom humanity to death. One son kills the other, and it grows, and that style of living, that wrong choice in life becomes what we call culture. Do I need to give you more examples? Or are you foolish enough to still believe that your choice to reject God as king, to decide for yourself, is different than everybody else's choices? Every day, we are faced with the option, many times in the day, to choose to trust God and have Him as our king, to have Him decide right and wrong, or to decide for ourselves, to do what we see fit. And like Micah, when we stand in the face of that choice, we have no concept of what the consequences of that choice are. Like Micah, we can't even imagine what could result from that choice to reject God. With that sin, with every sin, we stand in front of a Pandora's box, choosing for ourselves, doing what we think is best. Rejecting God's authority is opening the lid on that box. And once it's open, you can't shut the consequences back inside. Once it's open, the consequences of our choice to reject God spill out and cannot be stopped. You have no way of knowing who and how many that choice will hurt, corrupt, poison, or destroy. That is what we see in Judges chapter 18, the long-lasting consequences of each one of our sins. You have been warned. Think. Consider the consequences. Trust God as your king.